So, welcome back. Over the last couple weeks, we've covered circadian rhythm and real food. And today we're going to talk about the engine, which is movement. Now, I want to shift your perspective a little bit today. We aren't talking about exercise in the way that the fitness industry sells it. I want you to get away from that no pain, no gain mentality. That just leaves you exhausted and hormonally depleted. Instead, I want you to look at movement as a signaling mechanism. As a matter of fact, everything we do or don't do is a signal to the body. That also goes for food and light and sleep and all those things. But as far as exercise goes, it's a signal to tell your mitochondria to produce more energy, a way to clear blood sugar from your system, and it's the only pump you have for your lymphatic system, for your lymph to flow. So if you want to heal, you have to move, but you also have to move strategically. Now, most people move because they want to burn calories. However, this is the least important reason to move. When we look at movement through a functional lens, we see it as a signaling tool. First, we're aiming for mitochondrial biogenesis, the growth of mitochondria. So movement is literally signaling your cells to make more mitochondria so you can produce more energy. Now, the second thing is it's about insulin sensitivity. Muscles are your metabolic bucket or sink. And when you move, you're opening, the metaphorical drain for your blood sugar, which is critical for inflammation and hormone balance and energy and all those things. And then thirdly, the lymphatic system. Unlike your blood, lymph has no pump. It doesn't have the heart to pump it around. It relies entirely on muscle contraction to move, that cellular trash, the waste products from energy production out of your tissues. Now, if you're sedentary, your drainage pathways get backed up. And then finally, movement is how we close the stress loop. When we deal with daily pressures, we store that stress experience in the body. If you think about it, when your body experiences a stress, it's like the proverbial running from a tiger. Now, back when people were actually running from a tiger, they were running. So it closed that stress loop. So you had that fear response of experiencing a tiger, and then you ran from it, which released that stress response. But for us in our daily lives now, we experience all this stress, but we're sitting in a chair. So we're not able to release the hormones that get produced during that stress response. So it builds up in the body. The body's not able to metabolize the adrenaline and the cortisol that was produced during that moment of stress. So the physical movement tells the brain that the threat is over, and it allows your nervous system to return to that parasympathetic or more relaxed state. Excuse me. Now, when I work with clients, I use this three-phase plan to make sure that the movement is actually working for you, not against you. And of course, this is always based on the individual starting point, but phase one is really that low intensity. This will be walking, gentle mobility, it can be grounding. So most people want to skip this because they think it's just too easy. But this is how we move lymph and how we also lower cortisol without adding additional stress to the system. Then phase two, of course, is we need muscle mass. So muscle is your body's largest glucose bucket, but it's also your primary hedge against aging. So strength training is going to be a non-negotiable at some point for that long-term longevity. It improves bone density and maintains, a robust metabolic reserve. And then phase three is going to be some high intensity. This is your sprints and interval training and things like that to improve condition. But phase three is really only appropriate when your foundations, your sleep, your digestion, your hormones, when they're actually stable. So if you're currently dealing with some chronic fatigue or gut overgrowth or hormonal imbalances, you don't need more intensity. What you need is more consistency in those first two phases. If your body is already in survival mode, that high intensity interval training is just adding more stress to a fire that's already kind of burning out of control. So, we talk a lot about detox, but we often forget the most basic mechanical part of it, and that is the lymphatic system. And like I already said, unlike your blood, which has the heart to keep pumping it around, the lymph doesn't have that central pump. It's pretty much entirely dependent on physical movement. And so if you're sedentary or if you're moving in ways that are too stressful for your system, your lymph can get stagnant. And then toxins and waste products accumulate, which then overburdens the liver and causes all kinds of downstream symptoms. So you can really think of it like a clogged drain. When that fluid isn't moving and you're recreating an environment for an immune system backup and swelling and buildup of those metabolic waste products. So movement is the primary pump for these drainage pathways. There's another specific tool that you can use for this, and it's called lymphatic massage. And I prefer this over tools like dry brushing. You hear a lot about dry brushing. The issue with dry brushing is that you don't have the sensation of your fingertips where you can feel how much pressure you're applying. And with the dry brushing, you can actually compress those tiny lymph vessels and impede the flow further. Whereas with your fingers, you have more dexterity. You can tell better how much pressure you're applying. And so you want to move the lymph, you don't want to occlude it. But if you're feeling puffy or heavy or you don't really necessarily need a new supplement, you may just need to get your muscles contracting to kickstart that drainage and use, gentle, intentional massage to keep things going. Now let's talk about the muscles. There's a common misconception. Muscle is not a magic, static container that solves your blood sugar issues just by existing on your body. You can have lots of muscle and still be insulin resistant if that muscle is metabolically lazy, from a sedentary lifestyle. It's an, it's an active metabolic bucket, but it only functions when it's actively actually draining that bucket. So when you move, you trigger the GLUT4 translocation, which is a big word, but it's the mechanism that pulls the glucose out of the blood and helps move it into the cells. So you can think of your muscles like a glycogen tank, and if that tank is already full because you've been sitting all day, your body has no choice but to shunt that incoming energy towards other storage areas like in your fat cells or the liver, which is how we end up with all this metabolic dysfunction. But when you have regular daily movement, that keeps your tank capacity available. That's why it's so important to do those 10 minutes walk after a meal. That's one of the most effective tools that you can put in your toolkit because it literally forces that drain open right when you're providing that fuel. And the goal here isn't necessarily to build a bigger tank through like intense training and things like that. It's just keeping that flow going every single day, several times per day, every time you eat a meal. Now, it's not just what you do, but it's also how your body perceives it. And this is the difference between eustress and distress. Eustress is a type of movement and signals your body to adapt, to grow, to improve. For example, maybe you're training for a marathon. When you're doing sprint exercises, that would be a eustress because you're trying to get your body to adapt and grow and improve. It's that movement that leaves you feeling worked out, and energized. So your glucose sensitivity improves and your lymph is moving and your mood is stable. And so in that case, movement is kind of like medicine. Now, this stress, on the other hand, that happens when the demand of the exercise or the movement exceeds your current recovery capacity. So if you're already dealing with some inflammation or poor sleep or imbalanced nervous system, that same good workout can actually tip you into a state of physiological alarm, like a stress state. So your body doesn't see a workout, it sees a survival threat. So it'll raise cortisol, it'll shut down digestion, and it'll stall all the repair processes. So the goal isn't to be the hardest worker in the gym. The goal is to move in a way that provides the perfect amount of stimulus for your individual metabolic state. So if you're consistently feeling drained or you feel bloated or you feel wired and tired after moving, you've kind of crossed that line from eustress to distress. And that's at that point, you're not actually building anything. You're just adding more fuel to this stress fire. So how can you turn this into action today? So you could do a movement audit. And I don't mean tracking steps or measuring your heart rate. The most important thing is that I want you to track how your body responds. Of course, you can implement that 10-minute walking after meal rule. After your meals, get up and move. And it doesn't need to be a workout. You can just take a walk around the block or walk around in your yard, and that's enough to activate that glucose drain and keep your blood sugar levels stable. Another great time where you can incorporate some movement is in the morning when you get your morning light. So you could use that time to go for a walk and you can accomplish two goals at the same time. And then, always, always pay attention to how you feel. This is really the most important part. So if you're still exhausted a couple hours after your workout, or it takes you longer than a couple of days for that soreness to go away, then you're probably doing too much and your movement is tending more towards distress. So if you're feeling clear and energized, then you've kind of found your sweet spot on what movement is appropriate for you. So we're really just looking for daily consistency that supports your health and not that high intensity burst that leaves you stuck in a hole. So you just really want to keep it simple, move regularly and keep it consistent and make sure that the movement is restorative to you and it's not draining you. So that's the movement framework. And so we've covered why movement is the engine for your lymphatic system, how to use it as a blood sugar management tool, and then most importantly, how to identify when you're crossing that line from a good stress into a distress. So if you have any questions about all these concepts, then of course you can always leave me a comment and I'll be happy to answer that.